community. I'm grateful and thankful that they did that. I hope everyone had a, when we were through Thanksgiving, so we didn't have a meeting or something. No, what?
December we did.
December, Christmas.
December.
Okay, Christmas
break.
Okay. So I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. It's been a minute since we've been behind the desk. And everybody's back at school and motivated and ready to just continue to keep on doing the great things we do here in our district. Thank you to everyone.
Mr. Nichols?
That was quite an ordeal with the funeral and stuff here, and it was really exceptional. I mean, the way the community, the district, everyone turned out for that. That was very impressive. I hope we don't have to do it again. It's not that I enjoyed it, but I was impressive that the people turned out. That's all right.
Okay, thank you. And ditto with what everyone sitting here said. Public participation, no one signed up. Yes.
I just wanted to say that tonight our wrestling team is in the
yeah.
state tournament. Who are they wrestling this evening?
St. Mark's.
St. Mark's up there, 4 versus 5 seed. So good luck to Coach Toadvine and our wrestling team and the assistant coaches. If they win, they'll be in the Final Four, I believe, on Saturday. Yep. So good luck, guys.
Where at on Saturday, do you know?
Smyrna.
Smyrna. Okay, financial report.
Good evening, everyone. How are you?
Good.
Hey, Laurel.
So our accomplishments since our last meeting in December, the Laurel Elementary School submitted their application and received their funds for the recognition school for excellence in serving special populations. That was an $8,000 upgrade. Our final budget was sent to OMB and the Development Federal Office. And our related services declarations were submitted to DOE. Our opportunity funds annual report was completed and posted to our website. And a list of our planning projects for the enhanced NCI funds was submitted to DOE, OMB, and CGO. And also our academic excellence forms were submitted to DOE. The quarterly bond bill report was submitted to OMB. And our mid-year unit count as of February 1st was completed. And I included a chart on the bottom of the slide here to show the change since September 30th. Overall, we had an increase in total enrollment by 6, with a decline in regular education, but an increase in special education. Things coming up, we still haven't heard any more regarding our local funds audit or school construction audit for FY20. And the security cameras upgrade at Laurel, we're expecting to get them installed spring break. Our enhanced NCI allocation of $275,000. First of all, our FY23 regular NCI funds need to be spent before these funds become available. We have started spending on those FY23 funds. We submitted the reported plan projects, as I mentioned. And also, epilogue language is included in the mini bond bill, which was just passed a couple of weeks ago, which allows districts to raise a local match to these funds. The financial position report, which was due to the Department of Education on February 1st, we had an extension granted for us due to not having a meeting in January. That report is included in your packet for tonight for approval. And ESSER annual report, which is due to DOE on March 31st, we got started on that. And then the year annual report is due to DOE on April 20th. And this is an update on our reserve fund, the concession by month from last year through January 31st of this month, but this past month. questions from anyone?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura, made arrangements for you to present an executive session of next month, okay? And Mr. Downs, if you would join us at 6 o'clock next month for executive session. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, February 1st financial position report. Recommend the approval of the February 1st financial position report as submitted.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh? Mr. Lee? Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Unfinished business, the second reading of the school uniform policy. Recommend the second reading of JFCA/JFCA-R, student uniform policy as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education Policy section and as found at the Laurel School District sites.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
Mr. Lee? Mrs. Pugh? And Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
So approved. School choice. Recommend approval of school choice as a group. First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh? Mr. Lee? Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of school choice as submitted. First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh? Mr. Lee? Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Fundraisers, recommend approval of fundraisers as a group.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols? Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh? Mr. Lee? And Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of fundraisers as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
Mr. Lee? Mrs. Pugh? And Mrs. Isler? So approved. Rentals, we are tabling CII. So the rental is to retroactively approve request of Lieutenant Tyler Bryan, Laurel Police Department, for use of Laurel Middle School Media Center and Laurel Stadium Track to host LPD applicant testing on Saturday, January 21st, 2023, from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m.
I recommend approval of use of facility fees be waived and custodial fees to be, no, excuse me. Yes,
Second.
Fees waived, okay.
yes, use of facility fee and custodial fees waived.
Second, Mr. Nichols, was it you? Hello.
Yep. Second.
First, Ms. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mrs. Lee, Mr. Lee.
Approved.
So approved. Professional trips, recommend approval of trips as a group.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Recommend approval of trips as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Bus contracts. Recommend to approve the additional bus contracts of Mules Busing for bus 10 and 21 from Landom Bus Service.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. SAT dates. Recommend to approve SAT dates March 22nd, 2023 and March 23, 2023 for juniors. Request asynchronous instruction for 9th, 10th, and 12th grade students for March 22nd, 2023 and March 23rd, 2023.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Lee.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend to approve PSAT dates, April 19th, 2023 and April 20th, 2023 for sophomores. request asynchronous instruction for 9th, 10th, and 12th grade students for April 19, 2023, and April 20, 2023, as submitted.
9th and 11th.
Huh?
9th, 11th, and 12th. You said 10th.
9th, 11th, and 12th, sorry. Okay.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
So approved. Date of the school board election is May 9th, 2023, and we have one seat vacancy. Possible action on executive session items. A, professional. Recommend approving the personnel recommendations as listed in attachment A.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
So approved. Attachment B, support. Recommend approving the personnel recommendations as listed in attachment B.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
So approved. Personnel attachment C, administrator. Recommend approving the personnel recommendations as listed in attachment C.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote. Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
So approved. D, cafeteria. Recommend approving the personnel recommendations as listed in attachment D.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote. Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
Mr. Lee.
Approve.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
And Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
So approved. Personal attachment E, constable. Recommend approving the personnel recommendations as listed in attachment E.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee,
Approve.
Mrs. Isler.
Approve.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
So approved. F, athletics. Recommend approving the personnel recommendations as listed in attachment F.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mr. Lee. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approve.
Mr. Lee,
Approve.
Mrs. Isler,
Approve.
and Mr. Nichols.
Approve.
The regular scheduled board meeting, next board meeting is Wednesday, March 15th, 2023, 7 p.m. right here in the Laurel Middle School, High School cafeteria. Do I have a motion? We adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approve.
Mrs. Isler,
Approve.
Mrs. Pugh,
Approve.
and Mr. Lee.
Approve.
We adjourn at 7:20 p.m.
Wow.